What if I told you that the dark history of Israel in the Bible is far more intense, controversial, and full of conflict than most people imagine? When you hear about Israel in the scriptures, you probably think of promises, miracles, deliverance, the promised land, powerful kings, and inspired prophets. But what if behind this familiar narrative lies a sequence of brutal wars, spiritual betrayals, harsh judgments, and repeated cycles of disobedience that profoundly shape the destiny of this chosen nation? Have you ever stopped to consider why a people called the chosen people face so many crises, so many defeats, and so many dark moments recorded in the pages of the Bible? The history of Israel in the Bible is not a simple tale of victory and glory. It is marked by constant tension between promise and fall. We're between faithfulness and idolatry, between covenant and rebellion. From ancient times, when Abraham received the divine promise that his descendants would become a great nation, a shadow already accompanied every step of this journey. The promise was grand, but the path to it was traversed by fear, family conflicts, famine, exile, and slavery. The dark history of Israel begins even before the official formation of the people as a nation, because it begins in the human heart, in the struggle between fully trusting in God or seeking security in one's own ways. When we think of the Exodus from Egypt, for example, we remember the impressive miracles, the parting of the sea, the powerful liberation. But we rarely stop to analyze what came after. Murmuring in the desert, constant doubts, internal rebellions, severe punishments. The same people who witnessed extraordinary signs also questioned, resisted, and often turned their eyes to idols. The Bible does not hide these flaws. On the contrary, it exposes every detail with an almost uncomfortable frankness. Why would a sacred text record the errors of its own protagonists in such a raw way? What does this transparency reveal about the true spiritual history of Israel? Throughout Scripture, we see bloody battles, destroyed cities, broken alliances, and leaders who started well but ended in moral decay. The dark history of Israel includes wars in Canaan, internal conflicts between tribes, kings who abandoned the commandments, and prophets who warned of inevitable consequences. It is not merely a historical account, but a profound narrative about spiritual responsibility, divine justice, and the consequences of disobedience. Each dark episode carries a weight that transcends the ancient context, touching on universal themes such as power, pride, idolatry, and corruption. Perhaps the most intriguing aspect is realizing that the greater the promise, the greater the responsibility also seem to be, and, consequently, the greater the impact of the falls. The Bible shows that Israel was not spared discipline, even though it was chosen. This shatters many expectations and raises serious questions about election, privilege, and spiritual commitment. Did being chosen mean being protected from mistakes, or did it mean being held even more accountable for every decision made? As we journey through this story, marked by light and shadow, glory and destruction, a question arises that needs to resonate in your mind. What truly makes Israel's story so dark? The external enemies or the internal choices made along the way? Think about it for a moment and tell me in the comments. Do you believe that the greatest spiritual crisis begins outside or inside a nation? Because what we are about to discover reveals that the most decisive moments of this journey did not only happen on the battlefields, but in the invisible places of the human heart, where silent decisions completely change the course of history. And that is precisely why understanding the dark history of Israel in the Bible is not merely a historical curiosity, but a necessity for anyone who wishes to deeply comprehend the biblical narrative, divine justice, and the spiritual cycles that repeat themselves throughout the generations. We are not just talking about ancient battles or kings who failed. We are talking about spiritual patterns, about human choices that had real consequences, about decisions that altered the destiny of an entire nation. When you understand the context behind the conflicts, the wars in Canaan, the division of the kingdom, the growing idolatry, and the warnings of the prophets, you begin to see the Bible with different eyes, with greater depth, with more historical and spiritual awareness. Many people read these passages quickly without realizing the density of what is being narrated, but each episode carries layers of meaning. Each rebellion, each exile, each fall of Jerusalem reveals something about responsibility, about covenant, about fidelity, and about the consequences of disobedience. That understanding this dark history of Israel is understanding how promise and judgment walk hand in hand in the scriptures. It is realizing that election did not negate discipline. It is recognizing that the light of promise has always coexisted with the shadow of human failure. Therefore, I want you to follow this content with complete attention. Don't watch it superficially. Reflect, question, analyze. Ask yourself what these events say about faith, power, leadership, and spiritual commitment. Because when you truly understand what happened to Israel in the Bible, you also begin to better understand the principles that govern the entire biblical narrative. Now, I really want to hear from you. In the comments, write the following sentence: I want to understand the story completely. This will show that you are not here just out of curiosity, but for a deeper understanding. And tell me also, which part of Israel's history has always generated the most questions for you? The Exodus, the wars, the kings, the exile. Your participation strengthens this community and makes this study even richer. If this topic is already opening your mind and bringing a new perspective on the dark history of Israel in the Bible, please give it a like. This helps the video reach more people who also need to understand these often ignored truths. And if you want to continue exploring deep, historical, and spiritual content like this, subscribe to the channel right now. Here, we don't treat the Bible superficially. We delve into the details, analyze the contexts, and seek real understanding. Because what comes next will take us to one of the most intense periods of this journey, where grand promises began to collide with dangerous human decisions, opening a chapter that would forever change the destiny of this nation. Imagine the hot desert wind cutting your face, the sand getting in your eyes, the dry ground cracking beneath the feet of a people newly freed from slavery in Egypt. There were no palaces, no organized armies, no stability. There were only ancient promises echoing in memory, and a multitude trying to understand who they really were. The somber history of Israel in the Bible begins precisely here, not on a throne, but in the desert, between liberation and uncertainty. The promise made to Abraham centuries before seemed too grand for that arid setting. I will make you into a great nation, it was said. But the path between promise and fulfillment was paved with hunger, fear, murmuring, and internal conflict. The time spent in Egypt shaped that people. Generations lived under oppression, accustomed to the weight of slavery, to a foreign culture, to constant fear. When Moses emerges as the chosen leader to guide the Exodus, what we see is a direct confrontation between human power and divine power. The plagues, the parting of the sea, the spectacular liberation, all this reveals the light of divine intervention. But soon after the miracles, the shadow appears. In the desert, the same people who cross the sea begin to question, to complain, to doubt. The divine covenant was not just a privilege, it was a responsibility. And responsibility weighs heavily. The history of Israel does not begin in stability, but in spiritual tension. With each step towards the promised land, internal conflicts arise, silent rebellions, longing for Egypt, a desire to return to the familiar, even if it was oppressive. This reveals something profound. Physical liberation did not mean immediate spiritual liberation. Bearing the identity of the chosen people demanded inner transformation. And this transformation did not always happen at the same pace as the promise. The covenant at Sinai established laws, commandments, clear direction, but it also established judgment for disobedience. Blessing and discipline have walked hand in hand from the beginning. Notice how this duality already marks the birth of the nation: election and responsibility, promise and demand, light and shadow. The divine presence in the tabernacle indicated closeness, but the fire also represented holiness that could not be treated lightly. Every murmuring had consequences. Every act of idolatry generated rupture. The golden calf was not just an isolated mistake. It was a symptom of a divided heart. And it is here that the dark history of Israel begins to unfold more clearly. Because the greatest danger came not from external armies, but from internal instability. As they journeyed through the desert, that generation faced not only a scarcity of water and food, but also an identity crisis. Who are we? An ordinary people, a holy nation, a liberated group, or a people responsible for representing God Himself among the nations? These questions were not theoretical, they were existential, and each wrong answer generated delay, discipline, Additional years wandering without a definitive destination. The promise remained firm, but the path became longer because of the choices made. When the people finally crossed the Jordan River and set foot in Canaan, the scene is not one of calm, but of absolute tension. Imagine the dust rising on the horizon, walls erected before them, fortified cities like Jericho defying any army of the time. The promise of the Promised Land did not come wrapped in immediate peace. It came accompanied by wars, confrontations, and difficult decisions, recorded especially in the book of Joshua. And here begins one of the most controversial points in the entire biblical narrative: how to reconcile divine promise with bloody battles, how to understand cities being destroyed under the justification of a greater plan. These questions cannot be ignored because they reveal the clash between the spiritual context of that time and the modern sensibilities of those who read it today. Canaan was not an empty territory waiting to be occupied. It was a region marked by deeply rooted religious practices, pagan cults, and rituals that, according to the texts, involved extreme idolatry and moral degradation. Within this theological perspective, the conquest was not merely territorial, but spiritual. It was not simply about taking land, but about establishing a different identity based on a covenant with God. Even so, the unease remains. Why so many battles? Why so much destruction? The biblical text presents this as historical judgment within a specific context. But it also shows that the people of Israel themselves did not emerge unscathed from the consequences of their choices. And this is where the narrative gains even more depth. The conquest was not as complete as it should have been. There was partial disobedience. Tribes that chose to coexist with peoples who should have been expelled, agreements made for convenience, alliances that seemed like small concessions, but turned into open doors for spiritual and cultural influences that corroded the people's identity from within. This detail is crucial to understanding the period of the Judges, because what comes after the conquest is not lasting stability. It is a repetitive cycle of infidelity, oppression, outcry, and liberation. The book of Judges describes an almost distressing pattern. The people drift away, adopt the practices of neighboring peoples, suffer oppression from enemies, cry out for help. So God raises up a deliverer, there is temporary peace, and the cycle begins again. This reveals that the problem was never merely external. It wasn't just about enemies on the borders, but about internal conflicts, misguided spiritual decisions, and gradual disobedience. The promise of the land was there, but keeping that promise required constant faithfulness. This tension between promise and responsibility is one of the deepest points in the biblical narrative. The dust had not yet settled from previous battles when the people decided they wanted to be like other nations. They wanted a king. They wanted visible power, a raised sword, a crown gleaming under the sun. And it is at this moment that the story begins to take on denser, more human, all more dangerous contours. Saul emerges as an answer to the popular clamor, tall, imposing, chosen, anointed. In the beginning, there is humility, there is fear, there is dependence. But power begins to whisper in the ear, begins to alter perceptions, begins to replace obedience with convenience. Insecurity grows, jealousy takes hold, and the one who was raised to lead begins to act driven by the fear of losing the throne. Spiritual decay does not happen all at once. It begins in small concessions, in seemingly strategic decisions that reveal a misaligned heart. Then David enters the scene, a shepherd, a harpist, an unlikely warrior. A man described as someone after God's own heart, someone who danced with intensity, who wrote psalms overflowing with emotion, who wept, who repented, who sought. But the narrative doesn't romanticize. As David also falls, power, once again, reveals hidden weaknesses. A lingering gaze, an impulsive decision, an attempt to cover up a mistake, adultery, manipulation, death. And it is here that the dark story ceases to be merely political and becomes profoundly spiritual. Because it's not just about kingdoms and battles, but about character, integrity, inner vigilance. David repents, is confronted, suffers the consequences. The throne remains, but the peace is not the same. The family fragments, internal conflicts explode, and the brilliance of conquest begins to be overshadowed by invisible tensions. Solomon assumes power amidst grand expectations, extraordinary wisdom, admired discernment, unprecedented prosperity. The temple is built, glory seems to reach its peak, gold, alliances, international influence. But along with political expansion comes a multiplication of spiritual concessions. Strategic marriages become open doors to idolatry. Foreign altars begin to appear. Slowly, almost discreetly, the wisest man begins to divide his devotion. And here is a crucial point for those who observe this narrative attentively. Knowledge does not guarantee fidelity. Intelligence does not prevent spiritual corruption. The heart, when not guarded, can incline even after years of profound experiences. After that, division becomes inevitable. The kingdom splits, Israel in the north, Judah in the south. Unity breaks down, rivalry grows. Leaders emerge more concerned with political stability than with spiritual alignment. Idols are erected, social injustice spreads, misguided alliances are formed with nations that influence values and practices. Imagine the sound of hurried footsteps echoing through the narrow streets, the dust rising as mothers clutch their children tightly, trying to protect something that was already slipping from their grasp. Samaria falls, and it's not just a city crumbling, it's an entire identity being torn away. The northern kingdom disappears before the eyes of a people who believed they were protected by ancient promises. The fear wasn't just of enemy swords, it was of the question that began to burn inside. Have we been abandoned? Years later, the scene repeats itself with even greater intensity. Jerusalem surrounded, the sky tinged with smoke, the sound of crumbling walls. The temple, the ultimate symbol of divine presence, consumed by Babylonian fire. The smell of burning wood mixed with collective weeping creates a memory impossible to erase. It wasn't just political destruction, it was a spiritual earthquake. Where was God at that moment? Had the covenants made with Abraham, with David, failed? Or was the problem in the hearts of the people themselves? In the midst of the chaos, solitary voices echoed like ignored thunder before the storm. Isaiah warned of pride and social injustice. Jeremiah wept as he warned that judgment was near. Ezekiel had disturbing visions on the banks of foreign rivers. They spoke of repentance, of faithfulness, of a return to the essence of the covenant. But few wanted to listen. And when the catastrophe finally arrived, it was not sudden, but an accumulated consequence. The Babylonian exile was not merely a forced march away from the Promised Land. It was a painful journey into themselves, far from the temple, without sacrifices, without a king. Without territory, the people needed to rediscover their faith without a visible structure. This generates a profound crisis of spiritual identity, because when everything external is removed, only the most intimate question remains. Who are we without what sustained us? And this is where the story gains a layer that many ignore. Exile, despite being traumatic, also transforms into purification. In the silence of foreign lands, a more interior faith emerges, less dependent on rituals and more connected to the Word. Pain exposed wounds, but also uprooted hidden idols. The discipline that seemed like abandonment begins to reveal purpose. Perhaps God's silence was not absence, but a call to spiritual maturity. And it is precisely at this point that the shadow ceases to be mere darkness and begins to reveal contours of redemption. After the destruction, after the heavy silence that hung over Jerusalem, after the tears shed on the banks of the rivers of Babylon, something began to change. It was not immediate, it was not spectacular, it was not accompanied by triumphant trumpets. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, like a small flame resisting the wind. The people who had experienced the profound fall, the exile, the humiliation before the nations, began to hear the promise echoing in their memory again. The return was not only geographical, it was spiritual. Returning to the land meant facing their own mistakes, rebuilding walls, but above all, rebuilding identity, responsibility, and covenant. When the temple began to be rebuilt, it wasn't just stone upon stone, it was conscience upon conscience. It was a reminder that power without fidelity breeds ruin, that leadership without fear leads to corruption, that superficial faith cannot sustain a nation. The dark history of Israel does not end in destruction. It traverses the valley of discipline and emerges with growing expectation. Messianic hope gains strength precisely in this context of fragility. The deeper the fall, the more intense became the wait for a different king, for a just government, for a restoration that was not merely political, but of the human heart. And this is where things get more provocative. Because Israel's trajectory seems like an enlarged mirror of humanity itself. Repeated falls, cycles of pride and regret, moments of fidelity followed by silent deviations. The shadow reveals what we prefer not to see, the ease with which we exchange principles for convenience, the speed with which we forget promises in times of prosperity, the tendency to seek power without considering the consequences. But at the same time, this same shadow points to something greater. It prepares the ground for unexpected redemptions, for new beginnings that no one imagined possible, for interventions that change the course of history.